Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 30th of January of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And this video I would like to discuss to begin this video was the discussion of very important thing that happened on the 9th of January. You know that the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation provides us information about the situation on the ground. Of course, this is information from the Russian side, and it's up to you to believe or not these updates that the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation provides us. But on the 9th of January, there was very important thing that happened, but as I see, according to different Telegram channels, according to different social networks channels, nobody discussed the situation. So that's why I would like to raise this question. According to information we have, by the 9th of January, the total losses of the armored forces of Ukraine since the beginning of the special military operation were more than 1 million soldiers. More precisely, by the beginning of the 9th of January, the Ukrainians, according to the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, so that's why it's up to you to believe or not this information, the total losses of the armored forces of Ukraine were 1,180,000 soldiers. So this is very important piece of news, and it's very interesting to me why the Russians are not talking about this. Most likely the Russians are planning to keep this information as long as possible, and they're waiting for some certain events when they will show the numbers, when they will provide the proofs and so on. Obviously, these losses are very huge. Of course, once again, it's up to you to believe or not. If you ask my opinion, I always use the numbers of the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation not as a truth or something that we must trust without any doubts. I'm using these numbers first of all to understand how the situation is developing, because the number is very huge, obviously, and this is obviously one of the reasons why the Western countries and the Trump's teams should lower the mobilization age, because 1 million is too much. Ukraine is facing serious problems with human resources. Of course, we have no doubts 1 million is a significant number, because their draft age is not even 18. When we hear about moral difficulties and the situation at the front, it is worth nothing. If Ukrainians call on the whole world to support democracy at all costs, then they should act accordingly. So once again, the Western countries at this stage of the special military operation are trying to force the Ukrainians to lower the mobilization age, I believe not for offensive operations or not to attack Russia and to restore the borders of 1991. I believe that at this stage of the special military operation, the main purpose of the Western countries is to hold the lines, during the negotiation process. Because you know that these days we got lots of updates from Kiev about Zelensky that he is going to go for the second term of his for the second president term, and we have a lots of talks, which means that Ukraine is preparing itself before the president elections. But obviously, when talking about president elections, about the negotiation process between Russia, states, and Ukraine, this process will take time, and we're not talking about days, we're not talking about weeks, maybe we're talking about months, maybe we're talking about at least 1 year. And we understand that the situation on the ground will be changed during the year. Nobody can tell for sure where exactly the line of combat contact is going to go by the end of the 2025. Maybe this is going to be already the river of Dnipro. Maybe this is going to be already the central part of Ukraine, including Kiev. Maybe this is going to be Odessa. So that's why the Ukrainians need to lower their mobilization age till 18, to hold the lines during this process. Western countries will try to provide Ukraine everything they can, as much as possible, weapon, missiles, equipment, everything to support these forces. So during the next 2-3 months, Ukrainians will lower the age, and then we'll see what is going to be next. Of course, the Russians will continue their offensive operation, and the main purpose of the Russians is not to allow the Ukraine to join NATO, and this is something that the Western countries can't accept, and Ukraine as well. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. The Ukrainians suffer significant problems in the Sudzha direction. The Russians began outflanking operation with the purpose to attack the village of Nikolaeva Darina from behind. You know that since the beginning of the Sudzha counteroffensives, when the Russians were trying to restore control over over the Kursk region. The Russians were attacking the village of Nikolaeva Darinkas for several times, and most of those attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians, and the Russians most likely decided to change their tactics, because the Russians used to attack the village from the area of Obuchovka and Darina. Those attacks were repelled. Now the Russians are trying to outflank, and maybe this will allow them to change the situation in this direction. As for the north and Sudzha direction, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received almost anything, just several videos of how the Russians were attacking abandoned Ukrainian vehicles with FPV drones. The sources are saying that, and this is the reality, that in several days the temperature in Ukraine will go much below zero. The sources are saying that they're going to be -20 by Celsius, which will allow the surface to be freezed by the weather, and this will allow the Russians and the Ukrainians to use vehicles, tanks, and infantry fighting vehicles massively. So I does understand the thing that we don't hear anything from the Sudzha direction is mainly connected that both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, are trying to regroup themselves and to collect as many as possible forces and not to waste them for nothing during this bad period of weather, when the temperature is sometimes +2, sometimes -2 by Celsius. The surface is very bad, the quality of the ground is very poor, it's impossible to use tanks. But when the temperature is going to be -20 below zero by Celsius, this will allow the Russians to use tanks in fields, and then they will resume their offensive attempts to restore control over this territory. This will happen during the next several days, and I believe that by the end of this week we're going to receive a lot of updates from the Sudzha direction. The same story is about the northern Kupiansk direction. During the first 24 hours we received a lot of videos of how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainians already out of the city of Dvorechne. During the previous weeks we were receiving lots of updates from the territory of Dvorechne itself, because the Russians were trying to clear the village, and now we start receiving updates outside of the village, which means that the Russians either established complete control over the settlement or about to do this. Now let's move further. As for the central Kupiansk direction, I believe that the weather is getting better here, because during the previous 24 hours we got lots of videos of how the Russians were attacking and FPV droning the Ukrainian positions along the entire line of combat contact, starting from the northern Kupiansk direction till the southern Kupiansk direction or the Liman direction. A lot of FPV drone attacks, the Russians preparing themselves before the beginning of another wave of offensive operation, with the purpose to get as close as possible to the river of Oskol, to the southern part of the river of Oskol itself, and to improve their positions on the Ukrainian side of the river of Zhiribets, with the purpose to begin the third battle for Liman. Now let's discuss the situation in the Seversk area. Telling the truth, nothing happened during the previous 24 hours. Probably the most important video is coming from the northwestern part of Zolotarivka. In this video we can see how the Russians were FPV droning and attacking the Ukrainian positions in the southern part of the forest. This is very powerful and very important stronghold of the armored forces of Ukraine. During the previous several days the Russians managed to improve their positions in this direction, to take under control the elevation, and now they're trying to attack the forest, and if this forest falls in Russian hands, then the situation for the Ukrainians will become critical in the entire Seversk direction. Once again, we expect that when the weather is going to be -20 by Celsius, the Russians will begin offensive in this direction. This will allow them to begin the breaking, to start the breaking, or to reach the breaking point in the battle for the city of Seversk. As for the city of Chasiv Yar, today lots of pro-Ukrainian sources reported that in the place that today, for example, one Ukrainian pro-Ukrainian source reported and published a very interesting article. He wrote just several sentences. He wrote that in the place that used to be called Chasiv Yar, we are losing. In the place that used to be called Chasiv Yar, we are losing. So he repeated this piece of news twice, and so most likely, we don't know for sure, but most most likely the northern part of the city, of the citadel of the city of Chasiv Yar and the micro district of Novopivnishny came into Russian hands. When talking about geolocations and different changes, for example, pro-Ukrainian sources confirm that the northern part collapsed and that the industrial zone was taken by the Russians. But when talking about the geolocations, we have a lot of FPV drone attacks. But I would like to point your attention that today we got much less geolocations with FPV drones attacks in comparison with the previous day and the day before yesterday, because during the previous 2-3 days there were the days of the main Russian activities and main Russian attempts to attack and to clear this part of the city of Chasiv Yar. As today, the Russians are just finalizing the battle and they're just destroying those pockets of resistance that Ukrainians managed to save by the beginning or by the end of the 30th of January. So we are waiting for additional updates during the next days. As for the city of Seversk, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything, which also means that the battle has almost came to its end. We believe that by the Trump's inauguration, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation will announce the end of the battle for this citadel, and then the Russians will begin preparing themselves before another offensive operation in the direction of Konstantinovka. As for the current situation, the main activity in this area is laying on the area or in the vicinity of the village of Velyka. The Russians are pretty active in this area, and not just today, not just yesterday. The Russians are pretty active in this area since the beginning of November. If we increase the numbers of updates, for example, from the 1st of November, we might see that lots of geolocations, lots of updates are coming exactly from these fields, from these tree lines. This territory was well fortified by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians understand that sooner or later the Russians will try to cross Seversk Donetsk-Donbass canal, and they will try to take these positions under complete control, because the battle for the city of Konstantinovka is going to start very soon, and without taking these fields under control, this battle is impossible. But most likely the battle for these fields will start after the fall of the city of Chasiv Yar and after the end of the battle for Seversk, because the Russians first of all will try to flank and to encircle the Ukrainian positions in these fields and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. So let's wait and see what is going to be next. Now let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. The most important is the video that was published by the Ukrainian side that confirms Russian control over the N32 road. The first source that reported about Russian breakthrough in this area was the pro-Ukrainian sources Deep State. They published information about Russian control over this territory probably a week ago, and just now we got the video that confirms this. As for the Pokrovsk, original Pokrovsk direction, today we have a lot of flags, as you can see. The most important is that the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Zelyone. This information was provided us by pro-Russian sources. As for pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians control just 80% of the settlement, and the rest 20% of the settlement are in the contested area or in the gray zone. Anyway, if this information is correct, I believe that 1-2 days and the village will fall in Russian hands. Anyway, despite the fact that we still don't know whether the Russians control over the village or not, the Russians moved their focus further in the northern direction, and now we start receiving lots of updates along the railways between the settlement of Shevchenka and the city of Pokrovsk itself. Lots of FPV drone attacks, lots of artillery strikes. The Ukrainians suffered losses. So we see that once again the golden rule: where we see drones, this is most likely the direction where the Russians are planning to move. Today, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the settlement of Peshchane came under complete Russian control. Based on the report of the Minister of Defense and based on this video that you can see right now in front of your screens, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. Now there is just one village left in front of the city of Pokrovsk, and this is the settlement of Zverova. And some sources are saying that there are already very heavy clashes on the outskirts, which means that in 2, 3, 4 weeks the Russians will enter the main defense belt around the city of Pokrovsk, and the battle for the Pokrovsk agglomeration will start. We're talking about the part that is inside of this black circle. So everything that is outside is the battle, let's say, for the outskirts of Pokrovsk or something like this, and the updates inside of this black belt is the battle for the city of Pokrovsk itself, and this is going to be like the final stage. But there are still a lot of days before the beginning of the main part of the battle for the city. As for now, the Russians are trying to outflank, and as for now, the Russians are trying to deal as much as possible damage, not just to the logistic of Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk, but also to Ukrainian economy. Let's discuss in details. Today we got report that Ukraine has suspended production at its Pokrovsk coal mine as the Russian troops approach. The Pokrovsk mine in eastern Ukraine, a key site for the country's steel industry, has stopped operations due to the proximity of advancing Russian troops, Ukrainian industrial sources told Reuters. So we are talking about this coal mine. This is one of the most important coal mines in Ukraine, and this coal mine stopped working today because the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to cut the railways between Kotlina and the village of Udachne. This was stated by the pro-Ukrainian sources. Now we know for sure that despite how exactly and when exactly the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine are going to stop, the Russians managed to deal significant damage to the Ukrainian economy, and most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to restore control over these important territories for their economy. Furthermore, the Russians continue advancing. Most likely tomorrow we're going to receive additional updates, and we will improve the map along the railways as well. So basically, if the Russians indeed enter the railways, so the battle for Dachna and Kotlina has begun, and this is very huge problem for Ukraine. They still haven't adopted the mobilization law, and they have already problems because when the Ukrainians adopt the mobilization law, it will take up to months to mobilize as much as possible, hundreds of thousands, and then it's going to need another few weeks or months to train these soldiers. So as I understand, the Ukrainians will be able to restore more or less their power just by the May of 2025, but everything and lots of things can be changed by this date. The Russians continue advancing in the direction of Uspienovka. There are very heavy clashes in this area. The Russians, the most important, probably managed to bring the Toth Tower systems to the line of combat contact, and as of today there were lots of attacks, lots of strikes on the territory of the village with this type of weapon, which means that the ground operation is about to start, because after the Toth Tower strike it's very difficult to imagine if anything can survive. So maybe this night the Russians will take or enter the eastern outskirts, and then it will take just 1 or 2 days to secure the village, and the battle for Novosilka will begin. Now let's discuss the situation for the Pokrovsk direction. As you can see, we have, as usual, lots of icons these days because the Russians entered the final phase of the battle. The Russians began massive bombing of Ukrainian logistics in this Kurahovo pocket. In this video, we can see how the Russians were destroying Ukrainian bridges that were moving inside of this pocket. You know that there are several rivers like Mokry Yali, Suhi Yali, the river of Vovki, Orlovka river, and there is a huge territories under Ukrainian control that are inside of these rivers, and basically the Russians destroyed every single bridge that Ukrainians were using to support their forces, which means that the active phase of the ground operation has already started or about to be started. Maybe this night between the 30th and the 40th of January is going to be the most important and decisive, when we will understand everything maybe tomorrow in the morning. As for the village of Dachne, today the Ukrainian sources published lots of videos of how the Russians managed to get as close as possible to the settlement. The Russians took under control the final tree line in front of the village, and this information we got yesterday in the evening, so most likely during the day the Russians managed to improve their positions, and maybe tomorrow we're going to start receiving first videos from the territory of the settlement itself. As for the settlement, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions. Ukraine, as you can see, mortar systems and many other strategical points of defense. So once again, the active phase of offensive has already begun. It's just a matter of time when we receive the video with the Russian flag somewhere in the central or the most western part. Furthermore, the Russians improved their positions around the village of Velyka Novosilka. Today, the Ukrainian sources published the video on how the Russians managed to improve their positions to the north of the settlement by taking under control additional strongholds in the fortifications. So we believe that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, we're going to receive additional update, and this is going to be probably the video or the geolocation from the most northern part, and maybe tomorrow or by the end of the 14th of January, the Russians will try to take under control the farms in the northern part. And if the Russians are able to do this, then this is going to be the beginning of the end of the settlement of Velyka Novosilka. The Ukrainians most likely will not be able to restore control over this part, and most likely they will not be able to evacuate their soldiers. But Ukrainian commanders will never give an order to retreat from this territory, because they need to hold the territories as long as possible. They need to hold the lines until Trump's inauguration, and they need to hold the lines by the beginning of the negotiation process, and of course they need to hold the lines by the end of the negotiation process. But there are too much time between all these dates, and everything can be changed. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, show me Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.